from Pendleton has introduced herself through the chat. So that's another way that you could do that if you're having trouble getting onto the Padlet. That way we can practice using that tool as well.
And sometimes I use this with my kids if I'm wanting them just to share an idea, or you can add images, you know, share what's on their mind with perhaps climate change or something else. And Padlet is a nice tool to use. And we'll just kind of leave that going for a second as people are coming in.
So shall we get started? I know we're starting a little bit late, so we're hoping that we'll be able to go through our webinar, and we're going to start with the very first and what I think is one of the most important things that you can do to next genify your instruction, and that is starting with an anchoring phenomenon that drives instruction every single day, and that students are referring to and deepening their understanding throughout the series of lessons. And we know that in Oregon and in Washington and any other states that are doing next generation, that especially at the beginning, there was very few curricular materials that were available, and many of the teachers that I met were just told, here's your standards and go and teach. And I can remember myself the very first time that I read the performance expectations, and I'm like, oh my gosh, they're very complicated, and it's not a trivial thing to try to figure out how to do this with instruction. We also have teachers that are teaching with old curriculum. So Berkeley and I have tried to come up with things that you can do that are agnostic of curriculum. And if you have a curriculum that does not have anchoring phenomenon, or if you have one that calls phenomenon an anchoring phenomenon, but it's not really, this is a place where putting some time into trying to find a way that will connect all of the lessons in a way that is engaging to students. And we feel that it's super important at the elementary level that these are things that students directly can experience, perhaps in their own schoolyard or community. Middle school, you can maybe broaden the scale a little bit to Oregon and phenomenon that might happen in Oregon or the Pacific Northwest. And by the time students are in high school, you might be able to have a more kind of global perspective. But at the same time, the experiences that students are having needs to be ones that they can contextualize. So that's just really important. Examples of phenomenon that can drive instruction could be, how can I smell? This is something that we do in middle school, and it involves learning about the particulate nature of matter. So there's performance expectations that are in the physical sciences, and there's also in the life sciences, how does my nose work to bring smells from the air into my body so that I can identify them. We also need to make sure that anchoring phenomenon are complex enough that they can drive instruction, and a series of lessons can attend to them, and that that we're attending to the cultural diversity of our classrooms. And we're going to give you some other examples of anchoring phenomenon as we go through today. But bee colony collapse is one. We have a unit on that in 3rd grade, and up to what is the impact of ocean acidification on oysters in Willapa Bay is one that we're looking at a high school level. So we cannot emphasize enough the importance of starting with this anchoring phenomenon as a key strategy to next genifying your instruction.
Excellent. Thank you, Susan. So I just wanted to share one of the tools in terms of practical sense for how to make this relevant for kids, and how you might use a large anchoring phenomenon to drive everyday instruction. And it's a tool that there's a curriculum called iQuest that refers to as the driving question board. So a driving question board, this is what it might look like in a classroom. This is from my classroom. And it's a public space for kids to basically share their ideas. And the features that are really important when having a driving question board, it's important that students have an opportunity, that every student has an opportunity to share their thinking. So the driving question for this board is right in the middle there at the top, and it's, why do I look the way I do? And for 8th graders, we started by looking in mirrors. This was going to be a genetics unit that I was teaching. And so we started by looking in mirrors. And as most middle schoolers, enjoy, they loved looking in the mirror and then thinking about this. Why do I look the way I do? And out of that arose sort of their authentic questions and wonderings about themselves. So it might be something like, why do I have brown hair, but my younger sister has blonde? Or how come my cousins on my dad's side are twins? And it could be a number of questions that sort of spring out of this driving question. And the driving question board is really a place to sort of capture those and have students have a chance to share their ideas. So I'll talk more about the practicalities of how you might get to this point in a couple of minutes. But in terms of their science and engineering practices, this would be a really great place for kids to ask questions. They can even ask, science, as you're teaching, you can add to these and continue to build on their initial thoughts as well.
And I just want to add to that it's super important that each student has the opportunity to ask questions. And some teachers can be fearful that if they open up the instruction to students answering questions, that perhaps some of the questions that students would ask would be ones that would have nothing to do with what they were planning on teaching. But actually, that's not the case. For the most part, students are asking questions about the phenomenon that you were already going to teach lessons to. But what it does is builds student engagement in the process, that their questions are what's driving instruction. What they want to know about is what you're going to teach them. And we cannot underestimate the value of this. The other thing that I've seen in Berkeley's classroom is that these questions remain posted and so the students can see their question on the board throughout the instructional unit.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you.
This is another example of a anchoring phenomenon, and this one Berkeley and I developed a space unit on, and it was something that happened, and it was actually an aha moment for myself. I was sitting on a deck overlooking the Pacific Ocean at Cannon Beach, and that evening, I could see the setting sun, I could see a crescent moon, and Venus and Jupiter as I looked west over the ocean. And my husband and I looked at each other and go like, how is it that we can see the sun, the moon, a planet that's closer to the sun than the Earth, and a planet that's further from the sun than the Earth, all at the same time? And I realized as I was wondering that the model that I had in my mind of the solar system could not really provide me that explanation. So we were getting out napkins and rocks and shells and trying to figure out how our position on the Earth could allow us to see that. And it's actually, students are doing the same thing in the picture here. They're trying to figure out, using a model and a whiteboard, how they can see this phenomenon. And it drives all the instruction for the unit, and everything that they do, students will go back and reflect. How does this help me explain this anchoring phenomenon?
Thank you. And I just want to add to this, when I first started this, when I first posed this question to my students and they were looking at it for the very first time, we spent a solid class period just generating questions. And I cannot overstate how important that is, as Susan said earlier, for all students to feel like their wonderings are valid and keep the curiosity alive. So I just wanted to share this. This is how, when students have their questions, or we've spent some time, whether it's looking in the mirror, or trying to navigate the phenomenon about the planets and sun and moon. I have this on the board for students, and I am sharing it only because the structure that having these simple sentence frames and the structure allows for students to listen to each other as well as share their idea. So as silly as it is, we all sort of gather around the whiteboard or wherever I'm going to, have my driving question board. And it's a very important time. Every student has their sticky note in front of them, and they share their wonderings, and they have to connect. Whoever's going to share next has to connect to somebody else. So if I had just heard Susan talk, I would say something like number 2, I have to connect to their question. So I had the same question as Susan, when she said, why is that a crescent moon, or is that a waxing or waning moon? Because I was also wondering why the right side of the moon was illuminated, or whatever it is. So every single kid has to listen to one another, and then sort of connect their questions as we're going. And then the second part, and I know Susan said this a moment ago, but I think sometimes as teachers, we're scared that kids are going to ask something we can't answer, or, what if, I don't know, that they'll send us in a different direction. But every time I've done this, it's incredible how, what you can see on the right there, that I sort of cluster the questions together. And then based on the curriculum or what my learning targets or where I need to head, now I have the questions in their voice, but I can still put a larger question to that. So how do the planets move? Or how do planets stay in a steady orbit? Or does light have anything to do with how we see the planets? So students may have worded theirs differently, but all of those questions could be lumped together. All of their questions could be lumped together in a large question. And we keep this, again, very public. I teach multiple class periods, and I've done it all different kinds of ways, where I have it up on a large sticky, and I take that down so that it's relevant to the class that where their original questions came from. I hope that makes sense. Do you have any questions there? Maybe pause for a moment before we go on to our second.
And you can type questions into the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and ask a question.
I can't see the chat. All right. Should we keep going?
We'll move on, I guess.
All right.
So the second category of instructional strategies that we feel is extremely important are student discourse strategies. And one of the things that is become increasingly clear to me, that the strength of the NGSS instruction in making student thinking visible through language is extremely important, because we want students to grow and deepen in their understanding. And one of the ways that we can do that is to listen to students talking to one another. So we have 3 different protocols that we're going to share, and I believe we're actually going to practice one of them together pretty soon. First of all, I don't know if you had the opportunity to either attend Dr. Oki Lee's webinar that OSTA had just prior to the OSTA conference, but she also was the keynote speaker at the OSTA conference. And she has done a lot of work in the area of language and science learning. And we included this slide of hers to try to bring out some of the main points of why you want to have students talking in your classroom and talking as much as they can. That students develop this increasingly sophisticated understanding of science. And in the old way of teaching, with a kind of standard textbook, we expect, and where everything was kind of chunked into sections, we expected that students developed mastery at the end of those, that you would read something, you would answer some questions, you'd read something else, you answer some questions. But we're actually looking for our phenomenon to be addressing multiple standards at the same time, and we want them to develop through the 3 dimensions of NGSS, this understanding of just the nature of science and how science works and how we use science to explain the world around us. That as students are learning and going through a unit or through a year, through multiple years, that they're using multiple modalities. And so we're talking about access to basic common words that they would be able to use. We want them to be able to draw and model. We want them to be able to make accurate observations about the world that they're in, and we want them to have multiple ways to show us what they are learning and what their current understanding is. She also talks about the importance through a unit for students moving from just common language to increasingly accurate scientific language, and that we're not expecting students at the beginning of a unit to use the academic vocabulary. What we want to do is provide experience for students, and then once they have that experience, to layer on the language that's appropriate to explain that, and that as they go through the unit, that becomes more and more scientific. We don't expect that at the beginning of the unit. And lastly, that students are having the opportunity to talk in different ways with a partner, with the small groups, and to the class. And it's increasingly important to Berkeley and I that students are talking peer-to-peer as much as possible, and that it is not the teacher asking a question and one student responding, and that kind of call and response. It is a more traditional methodology, because that doesn't provide most of the students in the room opportunities to talk. And students need to learn how to speak, and they need to learn how to listen, and we want to give them as many opportunities as they can by doing that with their peers.
Thank you. I was just reminded today how difficult this is sometimes in reality in a classroom, trying to get kids to talk to each other during a lab. The tool we're going to use today is one that I heard at NSTA conference a couple years ago when it was here in Portland. And it's called the AB Partner Protocol. And what I love about this is that as a listener, it really requires you to really listen to what your partner is saying. So I'm going to click on the tool just so you can take a look at it. And then we're actually going to watch a short video together, and then we'll break into partners and use the tool. So the tool itself sort of, I think it's going to be put into the chat room.
Yeah, it's already there. Leah's got it for us.
So I'll just stay on the slide then and show the video. Does that work? Or do you want me to, I'll show it here first. So again, in a moment, you'll click and decide when you join your partner, who's partner A and who is partner B. And then you can just follow the protocol all the way through. It is really important when you're using this in a classroom to to time it and to sort of just say, so that's not sort of partners don't get into a really awkward moment. It's pretty short and sweet, and everybody feels comfortable with sort of a finite time. So what we're going to do is watch a short video, and then we're going to break into groups and use
I can interrupt. I seem to have lost your screen. I don't know how to get back to it.
Say that one more.
Is that, I think it's,
all I see are the 4 faces here. I have no shared screen here. Any idea how I can get back to it? I've been trying different things, including leaving, but I can't leave you.
oh,
There's no off button, there's no on. I have no chat button. All I have is the mute button. But I don't want to hold up your show.
It's possible that, did you check down on your, it's possible that you might have minimized the screen and then you're seeing just the, there's different options for how you view all of the participants in the meeting. Maybe I'll try.
You hit the nail on the head, because right now you got use partner AB protocol.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what's on the screen?
It's not. So you're probably looking at, you probably opened it with the chat link. Oh, actually, well, maybe I'll try chatting with you and see if we can figure it out.
Yeah, maybe you could put him in a chat room with you.
Yes, we'll do that.
I can now open the chat window, yeah.
Okay. So I'm just going to, whoops, sorry. See if I can play this. Hopefully, nope, it keeps going to the other screen. Sorry, hold on 1 second. And if I can, I'm just gonna forward it for a few minutes or just for a little bit. And so we're just gonna watch this video. And you're welcome to take a couple notes as you're watching, but I'll try to reduce that sound. So this demonstration includes a hot plate and a metal rod, and then the person is putting 4 different similarly sized white balls of Crisco, and you're going to make a prediction what you think will happen once he turns on this hot plate. And I don't know if we want to pause that, whoops, for a moment. Maybe that was not worth doing, sorry. I was trying to pause so we could have a moment to predict, but let's see. All right, if you haven't already, make a prediction and I'll go right back. I won't pause it again, how about that? All right. And this is showing that 10 minutes, and I gotta move this out of the way. All right, so hopefully everybody's able to see that. I could jump back a second if you need to, speak up. Sorry, I'm trying to get this out of the way. Would people like to watch that again, or are we ready to chat about it?
I'd like to see it again since I just caught up, if you don't mind.
Sure, of course. Let's see if we can do that. I'm just gonna go right to the end again. All right, so he's setting these 4 up. And then what happens is he turns on the hot plate. Move this out of the way again. And 10 minutes later, there we go. All right, so in your chat rooms, you're gonna have a partner A, a partner B, and you're gonna discuss, and then we'll come back together.
So I'll be opening up breakout rooms for everyone to get into pairs. But before I do that, please I'm going to post the link one more time. So, because once I open the rooms, you will not be able to see the link anymore. So just make sure you have that open. Hopefully everybody sees it in the chat. And I'm going to go ahead and open up the rooms. There's a couple of us who are going to stay in the main session instead of going to a breakout room, FYI. So Berkeley, I kept you and Maureen and is it Michael, I think, in our main session?
Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's me.
Hi.
I can put the partner protocol up if that would be useful. Let's see. Nope. Try this again.
And who in our group is A and who is B?
Oh, I guess I have it right here. Sorry. All right. Sorry. So who else is here?
We have Maureen and Michael. And I may pop into the other rooms just to make sure everybody has their link and everything's working for them.
Thank you. All right. Sorry, my computer was on mute again for a second. So I'm Berkeley, and I know Michael is here, and I didn't catch the other name. I apologize. All right. Well, does anybody want to partner with me?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Would you like to be partner A or B?
I'll start with B.
Okay. So I think that the Crisco's little balls of Crisco fell in the pattern that they did because the heat from the hot plate was moving down the rod. So the ones that were closer to the hot plate were melting or reaching a temperature where they were melting off first. And so, yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, so I heard you say that the movement of heat down the rod from the hot plate was viewable with quotes around it by when each blob fell off due to melting. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes, but when I use the word sort of heat moving, what I want to clarify is that that's really more of, in my mind, I'm visualizing the metal rod and the particles there moving more. And so they're bumping into each other and that movement sort of transfers down the metal rod. So I'm not sure if I want to use heat for that or energy or thermal energy or movement of those particles, but that's kind of what I'm envisioning.
So why do you think that you don't want to use those words?
Well, whenever I'm talking about matter and energy, I always confuse some of the language there and I get very self-conscious. So I have to think about what I want to be saying. So I would be talking about thermal energy and I think of the matter moving there. And
Well, I got that to work now.
Oh, there we go. Hi.
Hi.
And I'm going to move this to see if I need to say anything else, but I don't. So that's where I'll stop. Would you like to try it?
Okay.
Okay.
Switch partners and repeat. Okay. I think what we saw happen occurred because the heat was conducted through the rod And they fell at different times because the heat travels not instantly.
So what I heard you say is that the heat was being conducted down the rod and that it doesn't, I forget the word you said, but it doesn't travel instantly.
That's what I said, yes.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Or am I understanding you?
I think you're understanding me correctly, sort of, but my main thought was the heat was moving the molecules, vibration faster, but it takes time to play domino effect from one end of the rod to the other. Does that make sense?
Do you see our responses? I'm going off script here, so maybe I won't. Well, no, I will. Do you see our responses as similar or different?
I see them as similar. How do you see them?
I see them as very similar too. And I liked that you added the conduction of the heat going through the rod.
All right, score.
It's
Berkeley,
fun to listen, isn't it, Leah?
Yeah. I
really
popped
is.
into all the rooms and I heard some great
cool.
conversation. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you think we're ready to bring people back in?
I do. I think it's fun. Yeah, I do.
Great. They all got a 60-second warning before we yank them in.
Michael, have you used something like this in your classroom before?
No. Oh, look, it worked. I got back to the other screen.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'll close the chat. There we go. I understand the routine, and I think it works well to avoid maybe argument's a bad word, but to avoid confusion. Well, that's what I said. And
Yeah.
whereas they didn't have the chance to say, did I understand you? Did I hear you correctly? It's like you ask a question, you get an answer, and you either say right or wrong, when in reality you might have misheard them. So I like the fact that partner B asks if they're understanding it correctly, which throws it back on partner A, or the student in this case, to think about what they really said and might try to revise it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think we just wanted to have a few minutes, if anybody, I was just chatting with Michael, but what it was like using this tool, or if you could see using this in your classroom.
Oh, I could, yeah.
I was thinking about for English learners, there's a lot of support built in with rephrasing as an opportunity to listen again to what your peer is saying. And then when it's your turn, you might have more ideas about how to express yourself because you just listen to somebody else. So if I was teaching using this tool, I might think about partner A could be the student with maybe stronger language proficiency as a support for partner B, who may have all the ideas there, but just may not yet have all the language.
Mm-hmm. And I've also seen it done with like a partner 1A and 2A, if you really needed somebody who needed a lot of support, or you had a student, so they could listen to a full conversation and then have a chance to be a second response, depending on how much scaffolding was needed.
We also had a comment in the chat that it's a great conversation guide, but also thinking it might be pretty rote for students after doing it a few times. Have you experienced that, Berkeley?
I have not ever gotten into using it so often that it loses its effectiveness. I have a couple other strategies that we'll share, but I could see that happening for sure. Yeah. For me, it's always, in my classroom when I've used it, surprisingly really slowed kids down in a wonderful way where they get a chance to articulate their ideas. And then as Michael was saying, like just, share back, or there's those moments, am I understanding you correctly? And then you get a chance to modify your response. So it's pretty beautiful.
And I would just like to add on that we found that using protocols and teaching students how to have scientific discourse is very, very important. We actually need to teach them how to talk to each other when I first started doing the NGSS work, and teachers would come and say, I don't know how to get my students to talk to each other. They knew it was important, but they didn't know how to do it. And we found that using these protocols, that you can have this gradual release. And I've heard Berkeley talk about the beautiful moments in her classroom where students are using the protocols because they've internalized them, and they're just talking that way with each other, just on their own. And that's kind of what we want them to get to.
Mm-hmm. And the other advantage, I keep these in like little laminated pockets, is once students know the routine, they don't have to relearn it. So it's nice just to have them available. Sometimes there's a moment in your class and you're like, I want kids to be talking about this more, and just to be able to pull out a simple tool that's generic for any, any scenario, really, for sharing of ideas. So were there other questions? I can't see if there are questions, so for comments.
I've
No,
got,
it looks good.
if I may.
Oh, yeah.
Do you think there's a grade level that's too young to start this routine, and a grade level when it doesn't matter? They either choose or not to. Like, in other words, I think the routine should be learned way before 8th grade, 7th grade.
Mm.
I mean,
Well,
you could teach it to high schoolers and they would learn it rote like anything else. But if we want to make it internal, it happens all the time. What grade do you think, and all of you, what grade do you think is too young? It won't make sense to them.
Well,
We're
I
using
can
this in
speak first.
elementary.
Go ahead,
Please.
Susan, please.
So we're using this in our elementary units that we're developing in Portland Public. And I would say that we're using this at least at the 2nd grade level.
Yeah.
I know we have a 1st grade teacher.
Through high school, for sure. I was going to say, I've had
Same thing.
High school teachers who've said, I thought this would be silly. I thought my sophomores, wouldn't find value in this. And actually, it's really helped with the sharing of ideas.
We have a comment in the chat that they think we could use it K-12 with some modification. And I work with kindergarten and 1st graders, and I think they could absolutely practice the structure. Reading it on the sheet, maybe not so much, but modeling and practicing, definitely they could.
Thank you. Great question. All right, this is just another tool that we wanted to share, and I've used this. Sometimes I put this on the board and it's on my whiteboard. Other times, again, I have it laminated, but the importance of having an entry point for students to join a conversation, and just the simple scaffolding of a sentence to share an idea. So if you're going to agree with somebody, I noticed that, or I guess that's maybe not so much for the agreement, but just to make an observation, or if you're going to build on another idea for students, whether because if it's a language gap or barrier, or more of an introvert, or just looking for a way to join a conversation, having these as norms in your class and posted and available for students is huge in getting discourse to happen at tables without, a teacher directing that conversation. So oftentimes if I'm going to have kids discuss something, I will just say, look at the continuing conversation and pick one. If you are going to agree with somebody, have it in your mind, be ready to use it, or pick one that you're going to disagree. And it's nice just to have available for students. And as Susan said, with enough practice, pretty soon these transitions between conversations happen much more naturally as the year goes on. Here's just another tip in terms of increasing student talk, which is having students just read diagrams. So many times when students come into my classroom, rather than take out your journal or do this, although that prompt might be up there, it's usually something to get them talking about science. So this is just an example of one, a diagram that's up there that rather than just having that stagnant, the prompt is to complete as many sentences as you can by looking at the diagram. And then I model that, as the temperature decreases, and you can increase or add whatever word you would like into the particle speed also decreases. And so just having these sentences, and kids can go back and forth as many times as possible, sharing their ideas. And it just helps with the language and owning of their vocabulary as well. All right.
The final kind of big strategy that we really have found to be very important is the use of whiteboards to make student thinking visible. And one of the things that NextGen really calls for is for students to develop models that explains their thinking or a scientific principle, and that we want students to be doing this multiple times throughout a unit. They could be modeling their explanation for an anchoring phenomenon or for a lesson level phenomenon. But what we do for these, we're talking about 2 foot by 2 foot whiteboards, and we get shower board from Home Depot, and it's 8 by 10 or 8 by 4, and we have them cut them into 8 whiteboards. So for about $14, you can get 8 whiteboards for your classroom. And we cannot emphasize enough how valuable that these have been. But there's 2 strategies that we wanted to share that we use with students in as they develop models. So example number 1, I think, do we miss a slide here? Because I'm thinking that there was a slide before this. Yeah, the model.
Sorry.
The model criteria checklist. You have the controls there.
There we go.
There you are. So one of the things, as students are developing models, we want them to be sharing their models with each other in the classroom. And one of the things as students are sharing their models is that they are looking at each other's models to see what do they have in common. And what we want them to do is to develop this consensus model. What are the things that each of us are showing in our model that we agree all of our models should have in the future? Or if you have them go back and modify their models to reflect these common agreements. So you want to, for this one, we were doing, trying to explain how gas moves, and we're making the agreements that we want to show gas as a particle, that when you're drawing a gas, it has to show that it's filling the entire container, that it's not just hanging out at the bottom, that the gas is at the bottom and there's no gas at the top. That we want to show that there's space in between the gas particles, and that we want to be able to show movement. So we might make an agreement that in all future models where we're showing gases, we're going to use arrows to show that those particles are in motion. And what we want to do is that we don't want to make this secret. This is public information. This is information that the class has come to consensus, and when we're going to make models of gas particles, we're going to have these, and we want to provide those to students. And Berkeley and I would argue that you would even provide this on the assessment, that this is not something that is necessarily hidden or secret knowledge. This example here is a syringe experiment where students are looking at how gas can be compressed in a syringe and how it can be expanded. And you'll notice that it's very important that it's a closed system, which means there's a finger on the end of this. And that we're showing things in the model that we can't normally see with our naked eye, so we're kind of blowing it up and showing things, invisible things, or making them visible. So this is a model checklist for this particular model that the students came up with as they were doing this. experiment. And I think we have another example, Berkeley. And then this is a model for an explanation for why a skateboarder was able to go over a bump successfully one time and not successfully, had an epic fail in another time. And so the kinds of things that we wanted in this model was had to do with force and balance and unbalanced forces and friction. Where's motion and where's gravity? This is an example of using model checklist in assessment. And this assessment, the fogged mirror assessment, was given to middle school students and 8th grade. And I believe that the number 1 and number 5 are ESL students. And what we feel is important, all students were given the same modeling checklist. So we can also give them the scientific vocabulary that we want them to include, because what's really important to us is, do they conceptually understand what is happening when you're in a shower and the mirror fogs up? What is scientifically happening? And you notice that all of these assessments are showing gas as a particle. They have arrows, they have some of the things that we've been talking about. And I think we have one that's a bit bigger. So we just wanted you to take a minute to look at this student and think, are they showing the basic idea of condensation, of where the water vapor is coming from the hot shower, where it's going to, that it's a particle. And this one is also showing a hair dryer that's blowing on that to actually kind of re-vaporize that water that's condensing on the mirror, because this is an example of, we ask them to draw a model of why the fog clears from a mirror if you use a hair dryer.
I think we also wanted to pause and just see if, as you're looking at how this question is written, if there is an assessment that you have or are going to be using shortly, where you might see that adding a checklist like this might strengthen your students' ability to sort of access what's been discussed in the class and provide them a little bit more of a structure when they're taking a written assessment. So just to pause and see if there's any way you might see yourself using this sort of a structure for an assessment.
What we've found when we're using modeling as part of assessment is that it provides an entry point for students who may not be able to write down in using complex language, but because they're learning English as a second language, but they still have the correct conceptions. And in the assessments that we've been developing in both Beaverton and Portland Public, we have made sure that we have provided opportunities for students to do modeling on the assessment, and we really try to provide those checklists and scientific vocabulary for them to do that, because that's not what we want to see, is their conceptual understanding of that.
So that brings up a point on this picture.
Mm-hmm.
What about the student who says the air from the dryer just blew steam off the window? In other words, no thought at all about the heat and evaporation.
And I think as part, when you're scoring this, that would be something that would show you that maybe there's still some room to grow, that maybe their model isn't really showing accurately what's happening to the particles because of the hair dryer. Because I'm not sure that it really, what that's showing is, because I don't see the evaporation of those particles happening in this particular model.
Mm-hmm. You sort of see the little
See the other side,
yeah,
the condensation, but not the evaporation.
Oh, yeah. The arrows are all pointing towards the mirror, even though they wrote the word evaporation.
Yeah.
I would see it as the steam going to the mirror.
Right. Uh-huh.
Yeah, we're missing arrows in the other direction.
Yep. Exactly. I know we're getting close to our time, so I just want to, I just want to make sure that Leah, that you see that if you have to go, there's a link in the chat for you to, is that the link? Is there a link for the exit survey? Or
there is, and so especially if you need a PDU for attending, please fill out the exit survey. It should just take a minute or two.
Yeah,
and I'll repost it one more time. There it is again. And thanks for hanging in there with us. I apologize again for mistaking the links and sending 2 different links for this meeting, but I'm glad all of you made it here.
Thank you.
If you want to stay, we have a one more strategy to talk about, and I don't know. What do you think? Shall we keep going, or should we just take?
Show that. Let's skip this, but let's show this one.
This one, just show it. Yeah.
So I guess we can sort of just end with this is a really practical, very cool way to get kids in a safe place to sort of try modeling and also reach a group consensus for their models. So this, you would take a large piece of paper and fold it into 4, and then fold it one more time at the center to kind of create a diamond shape in the middle or a square in the middle. And each student gets to use their space in their corner, and whatever phenomenon or you are looking at, they get to use their corner to draw how they are trying to represent this accurately in their mind. And so each person uses one of the corners and then has an opportunity after those 5 quiet minutes to sort of draw and write and build their individual model or show their individual model. Every person gets a chance to share their model orally as well and explain and show symbols and walk the group through what their thinking is. There are some questions, again, if you're looking for more structure in these conversations, that you can provide for students to ask each other and require them to ask a question of one another. And then most importantly, after individuals have had a chance to share, everybody agrees on, they have to develop a consensus model. And so that's one where maybe one thing that's represented on every single corner or in everyone's model would be agreed on, and then they would put that in the middle, in their middle diagram together. What would you add, Susan?
Well, I think we have an example on the next slide that shows what this looks like in reality.
Thank you. So these are 2 examples where one has more words and one is being shown more with particles, but these were actually teachers who were looking at air current and airflow and what is happening with a change in temperature and how that might be modeled in particles and the movement of particles. And so as you can see in each corner, they were looking at having a candle in one corner and ice cubes in the other, and there was incense as well, so they could kind of visualize the movement of air. And then they were drawing their ideas of what was happening. And then in the middle is sort of their consensus model. So they all had, at some point, included particles and shown the movement of particles with arrows, and then came to a group consensus about what would be happening to sort of explain a convection current that they were seeing inside of the box,
And one thing I'd like to add is that unlike the whiteboard models that I showed you earlier, where you might have groups of 2 to 4 students working on a model. This particular strategy has individual accountability. Each student is creating their own model in their own corner. It also supports special education students or English language learner students because they can clearly look at other people's models, and that's okay because this is just a formative exercise. It's not stealing or cheating in any way. And so that is really important as well, is that we are providing those opportunities where every student has a pen in their hand, their ideas on the paper, the opportunity to look at other people's work, but also to have that dialogue and discourse about what is it that we all agree will go in the middle, and that all of our models are showing. So there's a lot, this is a hugely valuable strategy in getting student thinking visible.
And I oftentimes, when I use this in my classroom, I'll save them and we'll revisit them. Sometimes we do them on the whiteboard, but sometimes we do them on paper like this, and I will save them and we'll come back to them after we've done a couple more labs and say, what do you want to add to your understanding of this concept that was pretty complex when we started in the beginning? And so we'll layer on there, whether it's more vocabulary or now we have our keys looking differently, so they're showing molecules as atoms rather than just as a single particle or something like that. So.
And I think the thing that I like about these two examples is you can see on the right, they used no words whatsoever, but you can still get the scientific idea, whereas as the group on the left, you see this combination of drawing and vocabulary and explanation, even a bit of a key there. So what we find is that as students do more of this, they become better at it. The sophistication becomes better. We as teachers who are doing this with our students learn better how to support students in doing this. And I have personally found it challenging sometimes more challenging to draw what I think is happening than to write about it. Sometimes we understand what it is that we don't know when we do this more than we do in other ways when we're just talking about it or we're just writing about it.
Thank you. All right. Well, I think that is
the end
time for today. We're here for questions.
Questions.
I also added a link to the chat for our next webcast, which is with Noelle from ODE, going over the science assessments, the Oregon State assessment, as well as local performance assessments. So I know we get a lot of requests for people asking questions about especially local performance assessments. So tune in December 3rd if you can.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria.
Yeah, thank you, ladies and guys. But
Thank you.
on my screen. All right. See you next time.
Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, we have one question.
Okay.
We struggle with the timeline of these activities. Do you mean like it takes a lot of time to implement a lot of these strategies? Is that what you mean by we struggle with the timeline?
I'm going to assume that that's probably what they mean. And if not, I'll speak from the timeline as far as
yes, we are locked into covering material at a certain rate. And I'm working at an elementary school this year where every minute of the day is scheduled, and I know this is not uncommon. So I can empathize with that.
And I would just say, as a district science specialist for both Beaverton and Portland, my message to teachers was it is important that we're making time for this, even if you do less content. And I know that's probably very variable depending on your district, but the goal of a science education is to create scientifically literate citizens. And we need to have students engaging in these practices and processes. It's just extremely important for their own future that they can talk and think and view the world in a scientific way. It takes, and so to me, that's the ultimate kind of goal. And if teachers don't get to every standard because they're engaging in these practices, that's to me hugely valuable for the students. But I'll let Berkeley chime in on that as well.
Well, I was just going to add, I think the more I can pause and do this and not worry about pushing on, the more students are able to share their ideas, the more their misconceptions can be surfaced, and then the more authentic their understanding is of the subject. So to me, it's worth having them share their ideas, having them model out their thinking. Otherwise, they're sort of just regurgitating something that I'm telling them without having a chance to sort of argue from evidence or explain, why they understand it, to how they can understand something that we can't actually see, like gas particles moving or things like that. So I just feel like it's worth it for their long-term understanding if I can use these tools to surface their questions, to their misconceptions or misunderstandings, and then build on each other's knowledge. Really, that's what the classroom community is about for me.
I think in the chat there's a question, but like, how do we take this forward in when you have AP test or advanced high school courses? And we have embedded these kind of discourse whiteboard strategies that we've been talking about today in our high school science sequence. So for the physics, chemistry, and biology courses, students will be engaging in these practices. I know that in AP, there is a lot of content to get through, but if students have been engaging in these discourse strategies or explanation strategies all along, I imagine that you would be able to still maybe get to all of the content. I think that's always a hard thing to do. I know that we do these strategies in our IB. Somehow the IB course structures are more conducive to an inquiry methodology than the AP are. And I would actually personally like to see some shifts in the AP towards that, because our colleges are actually changing and using modeling in their instruction now, and we need to provide those opportunities for students in the advanced courses as well.
Thanks for those important questions, because I know this is a challenge that everybody's facing everywhere with NGSS.
Looks like we've maybe answered the questions of the night.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. We'll, as soon as I get a chance, I will be uploading this to our website, so you'll get to see it again if you need to. And thanks for being here.
And will they have the link for the PowerPoint, Leah, if they want?
I did actually share it in the chat, and I will also add it to our webcast archives page, so it'll be in there too.
Great.